Guys, I finally got it. The ultimate crown jewel of video game collecting. Mary Kate and Ashley 21st Birthday Bashie. This game was only given out at the twins' 21st birthday party. And the reason there's not many copies left is because there was a fire at the party. And they don't know how the fire started, but there's only as many as these as there was survivors of the fire. And it's gotta be like absolutely priceless now, so I will do what any sane collector will do with it and leave it on my shelf for all eternity.
Video game collecting. A phenomenon that's only growing in popularity and is currently bigger than it's ever been. Retro games are starting to become truly antique, leaving much of what was left to find at garage sales, flea markets, and your uncle's basement already found. Because of these factors, prices for video games are getting, stupid. I remember back when I was young, you bought old games because they were cheaper than new games, and now if you want to play Gotcha Force, then sorry buddy, you gotta pay 5 Doom Eternals. While a good amount of collectors buy rare games as simple trophy pieces, you have to remember that even with the most expensive games, the original reason that any of these were created was to be played. With that fact in mind, it leaves the question, how good is a $1,000 video game? I'm going to be going off the lowest possible price you can get the game at, not counting box, manual, or if it's brand new. Just the lowest barrier to entry to playing the game on the real cartridge made by the original company. However, for discs, I'll be counting the price that it would cost to buy with the case, because let's be real here, a loose QB4 isn't going to get you any acceptance letters.
One last disclaimer, a lot of these rarely ever sell, so the prices listed will be based off past sales and math. Just trust me, I'm a finance major.
I'm going to be starting at the $1,000 range, and because of that we're going to be taking a look at a game that makes Nintendo Switch Online look like the second coming of Xbox Live. Daytona USA was a pretty popular arcade game that got ported to the Sega Saturn pretty early on in the system's life. However, that was a bit of a rushed port, so eventually an upgraded version was released titled Championship Circuit Edition. Then a version of that was released titled Daytona USA Championship Circuit Edition Netlink Edition. What is a netlink? Well, it links you and your friends' nets, of course. It was basically a weird cartridge that went into your Sega Saturn and would allow you to play against your friends online. While other games supported by the netlink got pretty standard releases, Daytona CCENE was only purchasable from Sega directly. Amazingly though, while you would think that an online service from 1996 would be useless today, it doesn't operate through a server, but through your phone line. There are dedicated forums for people playing through the netlink to this very day. So if you have over $2,000 sitting around, you and a friend can play Daytona USA online on your Sega Saturn, which at the very least has to be quite an experience. Late in the NES's lifespan, many companies had moved on to the Super Nintendo already, but Taito, the developer behind Bubble Bobble, was really still giving the NES their all. Little Samson runs for about $1,200 nowadays, and it's a side-scroller where you have 4 separate characters to switch between on the fly, each having wildly different traits. It has an absurd amount of polish, almost on the level of a Nintendo-developed game. And you can literally see the amount of unnecessary polish by looking at all the frames they stuffed into the jumping animation. I am fighting against every bone in my body trying not to make a reference to a 2007 internet meme. The game was released to pretty much only be played by children who couldn't convince their parents to buy them a Super Nintendo. And that's a real shame because it's probably one of the better games in the NES library. Hey, you know that gun for the Nintendo? Obviously, it's modeled after a gun, but it has enough fakeness to it to look and feel like a toy. With it, you can shoot ducks and have a good old time. But what if that's not enough for you? What if you want to feel like you're wielding an actual rifle, firing at more realistic targets? Well, I'm happy to say you can satisfy this murderous fantasy with Max on Super Nintendo. Max, of course, stands for Multi-Purpose Arcade Combat Simulator, and it was used exclusively by the US Army. It's just a target shooting simulator, used as a cheap way to train soldiers, but it takes the word simulator to a whole nother level. The controller that's used for it is a gun that's designed to be identical in both look and feel to a real AP-74, making it the first controller that will probably get you arrested, or worse, if you take it out in public. The cartridge runs for about $1,300, and obviously the game itself isn't worth playing, but the novelty on this one is certainly high if you can get the gun too. Now, I don't know about you, but I just wish there was more golfing games. There simply hasn't been enough ever since Tiger Woods died. Luckily, the Nintendo 64 DD has us covered with Japan Pro Golf Tour 64. Running at about $1,400, it's your average golf game. But it's the only game on the Nintendo 64 with true online play. There's really not much else to say about it, but for one 571/428th of Tiger Woods' net worth, it's a steal. Exertainment Bike Rally / Speed Racer is a combo cartridge made for the Super Nintendo that runs for about $1,500. You may be saying, Exertainment? Don't you mean entertainment? And to answer that question, no, I don't. Some people in an office in 1994 decided that Exertainment was a good tagline for their game, and I weep for that marketing team. Exertainment is, of course, a combination of exercise and entertainment, and the reason for this is because it's designed to be used with an exercise bike. I, of course, don't own the exercise bike, but I do own the Speed Racer game featured on the cartridge, and I hate it. Again, definitely novel, but not really good. Now here's something that at first glance you may think you own, but in reality you definitely don't, which leads it to being good clickbait in the thumbnail. The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. What makes this special is not just that it's a not-for-resale cartridge, but it's also gray. There exists gold not-for-resale cartridges that contain the same ROM as the normal retail cartridges do, but the gray ones contain an earlier version of the game that lets you select between 8 parts of the story. For this demo, you can expect to pay a reasonable $1,600. It's definitely neat, and if it was any day before October 26th in the year 2000, I'd say it's worth every penny. But as it stands, it's just another novelty with some interesting historical relevance. Speaking of demos that cost more than the final game, Darius Alpha on the PC Engine runs for about $1,700. And it's a demo that you can only obtain if you already own the final game. Yeah, if you bought both Super Darius and Darius Plus, you would send in coupons that were found in the manuals of those games, and they would mail you Darius Alpha. What it is just a boss rush mode of all the bosses from Darius Plus, which definitely gives it some legitimate playability for diehard Darius fans. I guess it's technically not issued as a demo, but it's a selection of content from a previously existing game organized onto a separate card, so I'm counting it as such. Here's a game that you would probably hide from your friends. KO Flying Squadron runs for about $1,800 and is a space shooter much like Darius, except it's way more anime. Instead of controlling a ship in space, you control a girl on a dragon. And before starting the game, you get to watch an animated intro that runs at about 8 FPS in a lower resolution than Game Boy Advance video. Something about this feels illegal. The game says she's 20, but if I had to guess, oh, there it is. The game itself isn't anything too special. The colors are rather dull and the gameplay just feels slow. For Sega CD standards, it's a great game. And while it's one of the few games on the list that's actually a game, it's nothing too special. Donkey Kong Country Competition cartridge, actual title, is a selection of levels from the original game, but with a timer and score in the corner. It was used in the Nintendo Power Fest 94 competition, and was later used in the second Blockbuster World Video Game Championship, aptly named Blockbuster World Video Game Championship 2. Afterwards, the carts were sold in Nintendo Power, and now you can get your own for around $2,000. It's not exactly something you'd be dying to play today, and really offers little playability unless you're this guy who speedruns a demo. Moving on to the only game on this list that I actually own, Magical Chase. It's by many miles the most expensive TurboGrafx-16 game, costing around $3,000 for just a loose card. The game itself is actually really similar to KO in the sense that it's a more fantastical take on the space shooter genre, but this time it's executed way better. The level design is far more interesting, with the enemies and bosses constantly changing in variety. It's a much faster game than KO 2, with way nicer visuals. The only problem is it's just really short, but it's just a really fun joyride to play. Additionally, on the hardest difficulty, it goes from a simple good time to a genuine challenge. It's a really great game. Now, in case you really wanted that exercise bike but don't have a Super Nintendo, it's okay because there's also one for Sega Genesis. Outback Joey is a platforming game that runs around $3,200 for the cartridge. And it could be a great game, I wouldn't know because there's no way to play it. It looks like a platformer that somehow uses the bike, but again, I have no way of knowing. There's hardly any info about the game online, so... But moving on to something way more accessible, costing around $3,500, we have Dino Park Tycoon on 3DO. The reason this is actually a pretty easy title to play is because it's just a port of a pretty common PC game. But judging by the title and box art, you likely wouldn't guess that this is in fact an educational game. They made it more evident on the 3DO box art by saying real math, real learning, real fun. Like, yep, I'm going to let my child play my high-end video game console that costs $700 in 1993 money. While educational computer games from this era actually have a pretty good rep, such as Putt Putt and Flight of the Zoombinis, Dino Park is just much more bland. So no, $3,500 will not buy you the greatest educational game of all time. Finally getting to games that have broken into mainstream news, an ugly little blue Atari game with a handle attached called Air Raid. It costs about $4,000, and how is it? It's like any other random Atari game. I'm not writing a 20-page college essay on 30,720 pixels. Here we have yet another competition cartridge. Running at around $5,000, it's Blockbuster World Video Game Championships 2, and it contains timed versions of NBA Jam and Judge Dredd. In other words, half of it is good, the other half is bad. Now think of the simplest, most common arcade game in the world. A game that even after humans are extinct, it will still likely be recreated a few billion years later as a natural result of evolution. Pac-Man. Now imagine paying $8,000 for a clone of it. Clean Sweep was a blatant Pac-Man clone released for the Vectrex, and that can be gotten for relatively cheap. However, with some simple sprite editing, it was repackaged to promote the liquor company, Mr. Boston. However, hardly any of those were made. It's not a bad game, it's just not special besides the fact that it's on the Vectrex. If you already bought yourself Exertainment Bike Rally and Outback Joey, but aren't buff enough yet, there's yet another game that exists to help you get fit. Stadium Events. It runs for around $15,000, and you might have actually played this game before. The reason it's so rare is because it was originally released by Bandai, but Nintendo liked it enough to have it recalled so they could rebrand it as World Class Track Meet. It originally used something called the Family Fun Fitness Pad, but that was also rebranded to the Power Pad. Overall, I'd say Stadium Events is a great alternative if you're getting tired of Wii Fit. So I've talked about a lot of games that are the most expensive for their respective system, but in this case scenario, I'm going to be talking about an entire library. Games for the consoleized Neo Geo, named the Neo Geo AES, run from a few $1,000s to around $60,000. The thing about the Neo Geo is the games for it have a consistently high quality. These are the same games you'd pop tons of quarters into the arcades to keep playing, but now instead you'll be selling cars to get them. A great system to collect for if you need something to do in your mansion. Finally, to end it all off, we have 4 more competition cartridges: Nintendo World Championships, Nintendo Campus Challenge 91 and 92, and Nintendo Power Fest 94. Nintendo World Championships is probably the most famous collector's item in the world of game collecting, pretty much being known as the Holy Grail since the beginning. There are both gold and gray carts, but both contain the same game. They were produced for use in the aptly named Nintendo World Championships, and supposedly 90 gray carts were given out to finalists of the competition, while 26 gold carts were given out in a Nintendo Power contest. You could probably guess the name of the competitions that the Campus Challenge and Power Fest carts were used for. Campus Challenge 91 was still an NES cartridge, while the later two were on Super Nintendo. But unlike the Nintendo World Championships card, these were made with the intentions of being destroyed after use, so there's way less of these still around. The price of these carts I have no way of guessing how much these would possibly cost nowadays, but definitely a lot. But if you somehow have both the money to spend on one of these, and the time to find someone even selling them, you can finally experience Super Mario Bros. Yeah, Nintendo World Championships contains Super Mario Bros., Rad Racer, and Tetris, each with a time limit and goal before you move on to the next game. Campus Challenge 91 contains Super Mario Bros. 3, Pinbot, for some reason, and Dr. Mario. Campus Challenge 92 contains Super Mario World, F-Zero, and Pilot Wings, and Power Fest 94 contains Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, Super Mario Kart, and Ken Griffey Jr. Presents Major League Baseball. A bit anticlimactic for the most expensive games of all time, and while trying to play these is obviously not worth losing a house over, organizing a selection of quality games into a single competition cartridge does have a pretty decent appeal. which is likely why NES Remix 2 on the Wii U made its own version of this challenge called the Nintendo World Championships Remix, which had its own online leaderboards and everything.
So yeah, in case it isn't already obvious, a lot of the most expensive games ever aren't really worth playing. A lot of them have interesting historical relevance, but few of them are even full games. Also, there may be a few I missed because there's a lot of random Japanese games that are worth a lot of money, and with how much prices fluctuate, some random games could become worth as much as the games I listed here, but I tried to go over what I found interesting. As you can see though, I got out my Nintendo DS because I actually decided to try playing Mary-Kate and Ashley 21st Birthday Bashi. Who knows, maybe it's actually a pretty good game. So, yeah.